talk first about Russian strategy, because it does feel like the strategy has changed. The blowing up of the bridge a week ago seemed to change the strategy, so that infrastructure targets across cities that for a long time hadn't seen the scale of attacks that were then launched. It came as somewhat of a surprise.
I think the attack on the bridge was interpreted by Moscow as a real, a real threat to it and a real smack in the face, coming when it did, especially around Vladimir Putin's birthday. So I think their response was to basically try to remind Ukraine that it was at war. And I think in particular, the strikes in Kyiv, I think particularly shocked Ukrainians, and the fact that we saw targeting of, energy supplies in parts of the country going to blackouts. All of that was indicative of a kind of a push by, I think, Russia to remind Ukraine that, Russia still has options and that this isn't as sort of as one a war as might be sometimes suggested. And Russia may be, on the back foot in some cases, but actually still has an ability to really punch when it wants to. So I think it's really a case of Russia demonstrating its capability more than anything else.
And it's interesting that the words that are coming out of the Kremlin, because the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov was quoted as saying that the goals of Moscow's special military operation, as it likes to call it, haven't changed, but they could be achieved through negotiations. Is that a simple acceptance that Ukraine is advancing and Russia is losing ground?
Well, I think it's somewhat difficult to interpret sometimes because, of course, these messages are delivered in a very opaque and confusing way on purpose. But I think I would interpret it as being something along the lines of, they've suggested this before, that they would be happy to try to negotiate out of this. And that, I think that the Russians have now concluded that, their ultimate initial goal, which was essentially the toppling of the government in Kyiv and taking over of the country, is very unlikely. And now I think they're sort of settling with the fact that, well, there are other ways that we can achieve this. And I think through reclaiming the parts of the Donbass, the 4 regions that we saw, hold these sham referendums and then ultimately Moscow recognizing them, I think Russia would be willing to settle for some sort of a context where it kind of peeled those parts away from Ukraine, kept Crimea, and reestablished a kind of new border between the countries. I think that's what they're suggesting towards. However, of course, that I suspect is something that's completely unacceptable to the Ukrainian side. I think for President Zelensky at this point to just sort of sign off and giving away pieces of his country to Russia, the fear would be that this will just be a temporary cessation, and then a few years down the line we'll see Moscow picking up again. So I think it's an offer, and it's a way for Moscow to sound like it's being a reasonable party, and also a way, I think, to try to defuse some of the narratives that we've seen around them potentially using nuclear weapons, which has understandably not only rattled everyone in the region, but also I think rattled major Russian allies like China and India.
It's interesting you talk about that, because I wanted to talk about that narrative, because there've been some strong words. Jens Stoltenberg, NATO chief, warning of severe consequences. EU foreign policy chief saying that Moscow's forces would be annihilated by the West's military response if Putin used nuclear weapons. I wonder if that is helpful language, or is that what Russia responds to?
I think there's a sense in an awful lot of European capitals that part of the problem is potentially that until now Europe has been a bit soft on some of its language and been willing to sort of pull its punches rather than sort of standing up and showing a hard line. And I think what we're seeing happen is a growing number of European capitals that sense is coming through. It's worth pointing out it's not showing up in all of them. We saw President Macron of France this week say that there was essentially no way that France would use its nuclear weapons against Russia in the event of an attack that didn't directly strike French specific national interests or French territory or French alliances. And so theoretically, one can interpret that as saying, well, if something was to happen in Ukraine, France wouldn't respond. And that's important, of course, because France is Europe's, mainland Europe, the EU's only nuclear armed power. So, it isn't a message that's percolated across Europe, but I think clearly what we're seeing in Mr. Stoltenberg and in particular the EU foreign minister Josep Borrell's comments that there's a real desire from Brussels in particular and the heart of the European Union to really make a very strong point towards Russia that they are not going to give in and this is a war that they're going to continue to fight.